Hi everyone, I am Sophie. I'm joined here by Mia and Carla. We are 3 junior tenants at Littleton Chambers. Happy International Women's Day.
2025 was a great year for women's sport, from England's Lionesses winning their second consecutive Euros to women athletes dominating the medal statistics for Team GB at the 2025 World Athletics Championships. In the UK, in 2025, 48 million viewers tuned in to watch women's sport, the most watched year ever. And it's fair to say that women's sport is experiencing a meteoric rise, with global revenues, participation and engagement growing year on year. But behind this growth are some big issues which need addressing, and we're going to talk about a few of them today and about how they might be tackled in 2026.
One of the things that comes to my mind certainly is participation. You've talked a lot there about the rise in women's sport. We've had Red Roses, we have Euros, and so one would, you might think that girls wanting to join and become kind of elite sports players would kind of increase. But interestingly, I think Women in Sport have recently published a report in January, which actually showed that despite these kind of meteoric successes in women's sport, girls' aspirations to become elite sports players has dropped. Actually, it's the lowest in history since they've reported, which I think is since 2020. But it dropped from 38% of girls wanting to become elite sports players to 23%. So quite a big drop, interestingly.
Yeah, for sure. And have they identified any potential reason for this decline? Because it seems odd considering the increase in popularity.
Yeah, I guess, who knows exactly why, but I think they have kind of looked at some potential reasons. Gender stereotypes, I think, seems to be a big inhibitor in terms of participation. Sports is for boys, not for girls. Particularly, I think, in the area of sport, football, that was kind of a big view, and unfortunately does still continue, so puts off participation. And the kind of belief that girls aren't going to be as good as boys or things like that means that they're encouraged to they have more limited opportunities, less support, and at the kind of grassroots, the lower levels, that there's less investment. So I think all of this links up, but means they don't have many opportunities and investment in elite sports. So I think generally, just going back to kind of what can change, I think the general consensus there needs to be this systemic change in terms of, let's inspire a future generation of girls, let's have more visibility and equality in the media, let's have greater investment and support at all levels really, but particularly grassroots, so that we can see these girls continuing to want to be elite players.
One aspect of participation in women's sport is how Section 195 of the Equality Act 2010 applies to sport. And for those that aren't familiar with this provision, Section 195 is an exemption in the Equality Act which applies specifically to sport. Section 195(1) makes it lawful to treat athletes differently based on sex as regards participation in what we call a gender-affected activity, without this being sex discrimination. That's how we see sporting competitions have men-only or women-only events without that being discriminatory. Section 195(2), which is a separate section, is a partial exemption from gender reassignment discrimination. So that makes it lawful to treat transgender athletes differently with regard to gender-affected activities in the provision of services or the management of premises, or if it's necessary to secure fair competition or the safety of competitors. And there's also a definition of what a gender-affected activity is. And the participation of transgender athletes continues to be a big topic of conversation in women's sport, following the Supreme Court's decision last year in For Women Scotland.
Yeah, I know we've obviously looked at this in some depth here in one of our articles, but there's quite a lot of controversy, but also discussion following For Women Scotland, but mainly in the employment sector. So I think it's interesting in the sport sector and the consequences of the Supreme Court's decision that woman, man, they were the biological definitions, so biological woman, biological man, for the purposes of the Equality Act. Specifically, it was quite a narrow question. And I think really, even though we have this decision, Section 195 still remains the core consideration. And a particularly important gateway question is what you've discussed, whether the activity is a gender-affected activity, which, you know, you've got some sports that perhaps is a bit more obvious than others, but I think one perhaps, you know, more to argue about is pool, I think.
You're talking about the case of Haynes.
Yes, indeed, it's an interesting case.
That was a case that was brought by Ms. Haynes, and for those that haven't heard of this case, she is a professional 8-ball pool player and a transgender woman who claimed direct discrimination on the grounds of gender reassignment against the English Blackpool Pool Federation. And although it wasn't strictly necessary in that case to decide whether pool was a gender-affected activity, there had been expert evidence on this from 4 experts in physics, engineering and biology, so the judge decided the question anyway. Yeah,
so as you said, the pool was ultimately held to be a gender-affected activity because of the kind of the expert analysis that took place. Even though it was overture, it was quite a thorough judgment looking at this question. And I think in the court looking at whether pool was a gender-affected activity, there were quite some interesting points to come out of it. Obviously a first instance decision, a county court decision, but still some interesting kind of points to take away in the context of sport. That the 4 experts considered a range of factors as to whether it was a gender-affected activity, from the speed of the break shots, when I think that's how you instigate a pool game, and the fact that you have more of an advantage if you deliver the strongest shot, and so whether there was an advantage in being stronger or not, at the speed at which you can break those shots. And in reaching that decision, so looking at whether it's a gender-affected decision, and obviously it's a first instance decision, county court judgment, but still some interesting points that we can look at in this war context. The 4 experts that were looked at, that the evidence was considered, they identified a wide range of potential factors in determining this question, including the speed of break shots. So they considered that the judge considered that the speed of the break shot was an important factor in pool, and that absolute strength gave an advantage because it translated into a higher achievable cue speed and therefore a better break shot when it was delivered. And another factor was the ability to take more and more shots without resting was also found to be a sex-related advantage enjoyed by the average male against the average female, which was the comparative analysis that the judge undertook. And so ultimately it was concluded that lesser strength and reach put the average woman at a disadvantage when competing against an average man in English 8-ball pool.
Yes, it is a really, really interesting case, and you've mentioned before that the judge considered quite a wide range of factors.
Yeah.
One of them was the impact of hormonal cycles in cube sports, and it's quite interesting that was raised because for the longest time female physiology wasn't something that was independently considered or researched. It was just women were sort of smaller versions of men, but recently we've discovered that obviously there's going to be quite a big physiological difference, one of them being menstrual cycles. So, for example, in 2015, British tennis player Heather Watson broke quite a few taboos by attributing her Australian Open loss to her period symptoms. And there's recent research that in the English football women's game, women were 6 times more likely to experience muscle injuries in the days leading up to their period compared to when they're on their period.
That's interesting. I mean, you've talked there about physiology. Do you think, or do we know whether injuries in women's sport is only related to physiology, or are there some other factors at play?
Yeah, I mean, that touches on the real crux of the problem because we just don't have enough research. But to give a different example, ACL injuries, which is something that is on the news constantly in women's sport. Most recently, during the 2026 Winter Olympics, we know that alpine skier Lindsey Vonn had a horrific fall and sustained an ACL injury. But I think it's more prevalent in the news when it comes to women's football.
Yeah.
That we've seen, articles about it being an epidemic, that women are out of the game for a very long time because of ACL injuries. And I think there's some studies saying that about 2 to 10 times, women are 2 to 10 times more likely to sustain these injuries than men. However, more recent studies by the British Journal of Medicine, Sports Medicine, in 2024-2025 published a report shedding some doubt, saying that methodology of measuring ACL injuries in men and women's sports might be biased, because they fail to consider gendered inequalities that women face in sports, such as fewer training opportunities, smaller team sizes, and just limited access to resources. So there is a question, to what extent with ACL injuries, is it really true that women are prone to such a high degree to sustain these injuries because of their physiology? Is it maybe a flawed methodology, or are there things to consider that are outside of physiology but surrounding circumstances? Lesser training opportunities. We know that ACL injuries occur more in competition than in training, and we also know that women spend less time in training than they do in competition, generally underfunding, lesser equipment, and different caring responsibilities that then again affect the time that you can spend in training and in competition.
When compared to men,
when compared to men, exactly. And overall, we just really need more data. So in December 2023, the UEFA announced the introduction of an expert panel on women's health to deepen the understanding of ACL injuries. So this is a really developing area, but we do need more research.
It's maybe unsurprising that we have this research gap given where women's sport was 100 years ago. In the football context, women's games were actually banned by the FA for 50 years until, would you believe it, 1971. And the effect of that ban has been long-lasting. New research in 2025 has estimated that the FA's 50-year ban has cost the women's game around about £37.5 million in lost revenue and investment every year, and that were it not for the ban, the women's game would be 30 to 40% bigger by now. So the question then is, what can be done to support the growth of women's football? And one aspect of that is the need for improved commercial infrastructure and long-term investment in the women's game. And we have begun to see teams making innovative structural changes to facilitate that. In 2019, we saw the London City Lionesses become the first fully independent club in the Women's Super League. They had originally been attached to Millwall. They were taken over by businesswoman Michelle Kang in 2023. And since then, they've attracted new sponsors, Nike, MasterCard and others. And their self-governing model may become increasingly attractive to women's teams, since at the moment, any prospective investor into a Women's Super League team is required to invest through a men's team. But it's not a one-size-fits-all approach though. Arsenal have taken a one-club approach across their men's and women's teams, so they benefit from that uniformity overall. But by contrast, Chelsea in 2025 have newly separated their men's and women's teams so that the women's team will sit alongside the men's team rather than underneath it. And that means they'll have their own dedicated management, resources and leadership.
I think it's right to say that the men's and the women's games differ significantly when it comes to their respective revenue streams, isn't it?
That is right, and women's sport is very much its own unique product, and we may see more women's teams tapping into that to diversify their revenue. There remains huge untapped potential for external investment and sponsorship in particular, and that is critical when it comes to long-term growth in the women's sport. Areas like broadcast revenue are interesting. The men's game relies heavily on broadcast, but the women's game is less traditional, which opens up different opportunities. Just one example, in 2024-25, 12 Women's Super League clubs generated almost 30% more engagement on Instagram compared to 24 EFL Championship men's clubs. And we've seen similar patterns with women's rugby, for example, and other sports. The men's game also benefits from consistently high levels of matchday attendance, but that is lower and more variable in the women's game. So we've seen a greater need to incentivise repeat attendance and build loyalty with fans, which has prompted more innovative solutions. So Arsenal Women have brought in tiered pricing to reward fans for consistent attendance.
those are all really interesting kind of topics to discuss when it comes to the increase kind of the popularity of women's sport. But I don't think we can kind of finish this discussion without talking about some of the negative aspects in terms of the safeguarding concerns, discrimination, harassment that unfortunately kind of comes with the rise in women's sports. I think with the rise in it being televised, we're hearing more and more noise. Some of it's great, some of it's good, some of it's constructive, but unfortunately there's also that negative noise and negative actions that come with it. I think the charity Kick It Out found that reports of sexism and misogyny rose by 67% during 2024 and 2025 season, obviously in the context of football, and with sexist online content rising by 72%. So some pretty alarming statistics in that regard. And it's kind of across the board as well. I think Women in Sport has recently come out with a report in relation to kind of experiences of coaches, and it looks at various things in terms of kind of the support they're given and the opportunities, etc. But one of the aspects as well is safeguarding concerns and kind of problems that arise. And problems arise in coaching, I think, across the board in terms of both the men and women. But one of the kind of findings or the realities, I think it was called in the report, was the view that there are inadequate policies tackling misogyny and protecting women in coaching. I think there's often a lot of consideration about kind of anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, but perhaps more needs to be done specifically in relation to kind of the prevention of this rise in misogyny and kind of these comments that are being made and these actions that are happening. So pretty concerning.
Yeah, hopefully we'll see some of those changes coming out more. Statistics like that are really alarming, as you say. Yeah,
and I think it kind of, we see these issues. These aren't just statistics. Obviously, you can get wrapped up. We've talked about a lot of reports today. You can kind of get wrapped up in statistics and numbers, but these do translate to real life examples and to real life instances. I mean, we've seen in the news. I think you can go kind of on the news and such. There's various instances from kind of a former women's manager who was banned for 12 years, I think it was, by the FA for sending sexually explicit photos to players and I think one member of staff. You also have, some professional female tennis players that talk online about the online abuse. I mean, women's footballers as well have come out, and it's not specific necessarily to sex. We've also got some racist online abuse, etc. But just in the context of women's sports, I think we do have a serious problem with online abuse in terms of kind of misogyny and these sexist comments that are being targeted at these women, these impressive women female athletes. It's really sad to see.
And in terms of sort of timings, what do you think, how long will it take for us to see these problems be tackled?
Gosh, how long's a piece of string? I mean, I'd love to say tomorrow. I think that the real question is how can we tackle these, or what can we do to improve kind of this position? I think we have a lot of domestic legislative change that is helping. We've got various acts. I think the recent changes in the Equality Act. There are some that came in last year, or 2026, so 2024 they came in, I think, in terms of the duty, the reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment, and the government are wanting to include, following the Employment Rights Act 2025, the prevention of third-party harassment, which is important because some of the comments made in these reports is that actually often a lot of the harassment or the comments come from fans. It's not necessarily, within the institution itself, it's actually third parties that attend these stadiums so I think legislative change will help, but also we have to recognise there needs to be steps taken internally in terms of risk assessments that are done, policies that are done and kept up to date, training that is done and kept up to date, investigations as soon as things are reported, and strong and swift action from internal organisations and the regulators as soon as, if it is found that some untoward action or comments, etc. have taken place or been said.
So obviously we could be here and talk about these issues all day, but this is about all the time that we have. So we look forward to 2026, what is to come and how some of these issues can be tackled. So thank you very much for listening and happy Women's Day.